Hello, and welcome to All Things Chemical, a podcast produced by Bergeson and Campbell, a Washington, D.C. law firm focusing on chemical law, business, and litigation matters. I'm Lynn Bergeson. This week, I had the real pleasure to welcome back to the studio Jim Aidala, Senior Government Affairs Consultant at Bergeson and Campbell and its consulting affiliate, the ACTA Group, and Claire Hansen, an associate with B&C and regulatory analyst with ACTA, to discuss the ever-changing influence of foreign policy on the chemical industry. As I think we all know, there is a lot going on in the world, and much of it may seem somewhat tangential to the chemical industry. On closer inspection, Claire and Jim's January 27th blog notes otherwise and lays out the reasons why international events, trade-related matters, and multilateral institutions have a significant impact on domestic chemical regulation and policy. During our podcast, we discuss why chemical companies are paying really close attention to foreign policy, trade policy, and related international issues, the pending Supreme Court case on the president's authority to impose tariffs, the unpredictability of the financial markets, and a wide range of other topics that I think you're going to find very interesting. Now, here is my conversation with Jim Aidala and Claire Hansen. Well, Claire and Jim, wonderful to have you both back. Thank you for being with me today.
Thank you for having us.
Sure, happy to be here.
Well, for the benefit of our listeners, I want to make sure everyone knows we have a number of fabulous blogs. We have one entitled Public Policy and Regulation blog, and you both authored a fabulous blog dated January 27th titled Uncertain U.S. Foreign Policy Implications for Chemical Regulation and Trade, because I thought the blog was so topical, timely, and well-written. We're having a discussion today on our podcast about these very topics. So with regard to the blog that we wrote on January 27th, the premise of that blog, to me anyway, seems to be that U.S. foreign policy is materially impactful and consequential with respect to domestic chemical regulation, market access, and policy. Claire, what prompted the identification of this topic?
Well, Lynn, Jim and I, before we write any of these blogs, we just generally talk about what's going on both in the U.S. and the foreign markets. And one of the things that Jim had specifically identified was the idea that the president of the United States at the time was very keen on taking over the country of Greenland and was threatening, the concept or prospect of issuing tariffs against any country that did not wholeheartedly support the idea that the United States would take over Greenland.
Right.
Yes.
Or just invading, period, either way. But go ahead.
Whatever.
Yes. And this was a rather new topic for the United States and for trade globally. And it was just a very interesting topic because this had never really happened before. And while the United States did not take over Greenland, it was a very, very interesting time in the United States. And so we just thought that we could talk about the impact that the threats of tariffs could even have on the financial market and the chemical regulatory market, but within the United States and globally.
Inviting financial instability, volatility, uncertainty, right, Jim?
Well, right. And it's not, tariffs are not a new item in the last year, to say the least, but it's more that and so is the variable tariffs. Today it's X and tomorrow it could be Y, but simply the mere concept of the now anticipated possible volatility or unevenness or uncertainty and all that. And as we all know, having dealt with clients or reading things generally, businesses really don't like uncertainty. Even if you have a bad market, a good market, a hostile trading partner, or a very good trading relationship, the uncertainty is what will be especially maddening and make for problems planning the future. I assume that's some of that's what we were trying to talk about in the blog, and I assume that's what we're going to be talking about more today.
Exactly right, Jim. I think the bottom line is, chemical companies and maybe businesses writ large are paying much more focused attention on foreign policy developments because of the uncertainty that you've already identified, the volatility of the markets, the unpredictability of certain aspects of U.S. policy with respect to our trading partners and others. So, what should chemical companies in particular be paying attention to with regard to these foreign policy developments?
Well, there are a number of things that I think we outlined in a series of our blogs that chemical companies should be paying attention to regarding foreign policy developments, whether that's new regulations regarding imports or exports. And that could be reporting obligations, that could be a chemical that is barred from trade or is barred from certain uses, either in a country or exiting a country and coming into the United States. And so those are obviously some of the things that more traditionally chemical companies have had to pay attention to in the past. With the rise of the tariffs in this case in particular, that's another thing that companies should just be paying attention to, or at least thinking about before engaging in any sort of new business with new companies or other companies outside of the United States. I think this administration in particular has highlighted the fact that very few things are made solely in the United States. A car, for example, might be physically assembled in the United States, but all of its pieces are likely coming from,
A million
countries,
different places.
countries all over the place. And, so if you need a chip to make a car work and that chip is manufactured outside of the United States, then that could be subject to a tariff. And it could be one thing if that tariff is 5% or 10%, but if that tariff goes up to as high as 50%, which is as high as some of these tariffs have been threatened, then that could have a really substantial impact on businesses. And so in addition to paying attention to all of the other chemical regulatory policy issues and reporting issues that companies have had to pay attention to, increasingly, more or less from 2020 onward, this is just another thing that companies should be aware of and should take into consideration when doing business.
Totally agree. Jim, maybe we can dig down into that. What are the ways that tariffs, supply chain controls, and just the diplomatic posturing that's going on and has for over a year now influenced chemical markets?
Well, the most obvious, of course, is that volatility, as we've already spoken about, creates compliance and planning challenges, to say the least. The other thing, I just remember there used to be an ad not seen for a while. I'm sure it would still be good, if you will. BDO, was it some big, corporate
Oh,
types
yeah.
talking in the hallway about we just bought. The board just bought another global partner. Oh boy! Well, now we've got 37 new regimes we have to deal with and different schedules and laws and requirements. And so who's going to do it? Well, BDO. And I'm not advertising for them. They're not a competitor, so go ahead and use them. But the point there also being just generally that when you trade with another country and increasingly you're trading not just with their laws and requirements and their tariffs and things, you're sort of also have to deal with their domestic political interest, which is, again, an obvious sentence. But then in the current context, it means international relations. What if they get really mad and up their tariffs? What if they just and forget tariffs and things, just they have a different compliance setting? And I think one thing that's becoming an increasing concern, at least in my head when I think about these things, is reputational damage. Because it's just generally, the larger issue sometimes in the broad media is discussed as, is America a reliable trading partner? Well, when that sentence is, mentioned by the, Secretary of State of either our country or the other countries, that has effects potentially on just even a small business, a relatively smaller business that's trying to have some kind of international market or just has international customers.
Hmm.
Even if they don't have the international market per se, their customers do. And then they have to rely on what all these rules and regulations and international relations and the ways it can interact may have on their customers. And they may not even know all their customers. Their customers may be domestic per se, but they have some global presence or, again, customer base, or just they supply somebody somewhere else. And all that has cascading effects together when, again, either uncertainty or the U.S. can't be trusted or the U.S. may change their mind, or you need to name your capital city in your country after, our president or something, or Well, so it's going to be a big, all kinds of crazy things that are unpredictable. And that's kind of what a lot of people seem to be facing right now in the international market.
Jim and I, we're older than Claire, but I think looking back over past administrations, my sense is the level of volatility that we have in the world today, and given our own domestic policies, the level of volatility is significantly more extreme than in prior administrations. Do you share that view?
Well, sure. I mean, there's always been trade issues. The spasms of what's it going to mean that China joined, World Trade Organizations. What about the Canada and Mexico agreements were negotiated before? All kinds of things have always been a big issue. Trade was always a dominant issue, and even in EPA space when I was at EPA, just simply the phytosanitary standards. That doesn't
Mhm.
sound like much. It doesn't sound anything as big and hairy as invading Greenland or whatever else you want to comment about that, but simply non-tariff trade barriers. The way that you can try and keep a market a little more to your own selves, to your own producers. And and that's also why some of these things take years and years and years to negotiate, which is, again, extra maddening if you're used to saying, well, today the tariffs are 15%, tomorrow they could be 40%. Well, hold it. All the fine print usually takes a real long time, literally years in many cases, to negotiate. So
Right.
how's all that gonna work? Unpredictability just, again, complicates long-term investment decisions. How do you decide what your markets might be, not just today or even in the near term, but even over the medium term? Again, if one of our clients is trying to think, well, maybe we ought to have more of a European presence, how do we start to get there? And, meantime, first we have to worry about a distribution system. We have to be able to get the products to those potential foreign markets, and there's the foreign customers. Maybe we'll have some customers over there that then also distribute all those kind of things with all this uncertainty going on. And you can adapt to very strict rules. In Europe, you only have to have a certain kind of recyclable cardboard. You can't use your packaging to be another kind or what have you that you're used to. Okay, well, you learn to deal with strict requirements, but they may change. In the meantime, it may cost 30% more tomorrow, and that may affect your market, to say the least. So again, it takes lead time to really plan all these things, and that's really hard with all the other uncertainty that's going around with trade issues right now.
Agree, and it complicates an already complicated mosaic, right, of international regulation. Claire, you've written a lot on the European Union deforestation regulation, which will be coming into effect at the end of this year. I mean, for business executives trying to plan, that their next step, investment in foreign countries or foreign country companies planning investment in the United States, watching all of these international developments on top of U.S. foreign policy is, I think, a daunting task and one that requires courage, vigilance, leadership, and a relentless eye on the bottom line.
Yeah, for sure. And that's not even to mention the mosaic of state regulations that are being implemented all over the country.
Yeah, I would imagine, this it's not for this podcast, but, our tracking of PFAS regulation at the state level, the federal level is definitely putting a dent on time and planning opportunities. We've been very, very busy in tracking PFAS regulation in Minnesota, all over the country, and that will continue through the year. But I had mentioned in particular the EU
Mhm.
deforestation regulation, recognizing that it's unlikely to be extended yet again in 2027. But it's just an illustration of how do business executives plan, how important it is to monitor domestic and international regulatory developments because they are ever changing, and the instability and volatility of the U.S. foreign policy dimension these days adds an extra layer of complexity, intrigue, and unpredictability into that mix. Well, speaking of unpredictable, I know we had another fabulous blog by you two in November, the Supreme Court's tariff case and its ripple effects for the chemical regulatory community. Big question here is how do tariffs and the pending Supreme Court decision in Trump v. VOS selections fit into the broader discussion? And just for the benefit of our listeners, President Trump's authority to impose broad tariffs via executive order issued last year has been called into question. Oral argument was heard on November the 5th. To my ear, listening to the oral argument in that case, the court expressed some skepticism as to the legitimacy of President Trump's authority in this case. Court watchers and the business community writ large are watching this case like a hawk.
Yes, they are.
The justices will take the bench again on February 20th after its winter recess. What about tariffs and chemical policy? Based on your November 7th blog, the case has very significant implications for the chemical regulatory community. What say you about the case? When is it going to be issued? What are the issues relevant to this discussion? And when do you think it's going to drop?
I wish I could tell you when I thought this was going to drop.
You could make some money in Vegas, right?
But the fact that it is taking as long as it has indicates that there are probably multiple opinions being issued, or there could be multiple opinions being issued on this case. Specifically, this case asks whether or not the president has the authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to unilaterally impose tariffs. And specifically, these tariffs were in response to the threat of foreign drug trade or foreign drugs entering the United States illegally. And these tariffs were issued in response to that. And a number of companies have challenged the president's authority to do so under the Constitution, because traditionally only Congress has been able to issue taxes like these. And so the question is whether or not these tariffs unreasonably expand the president's power to tax the American public and to tax corporations. The question before the Supreme Court, sorry, what was your question?
Well, some people claim that at its heart, the case really raises separation of powers questions, whether Congress delegated too much authority or whether certain tariffs effectively operate as taxes that should originate in Congress and exclusively in Congress. A view I happen to share.
Yeah, I mean, this case asks a really interesting question because, on the one hand, the president of the United States needs to be able to respond to reasonable and legitimate issues that would warrant short tariffs being imposed on certain countries that pose an immediate threat to the United States. It's unclear whether or not this case would meet those requirements, and that's, of course, being decided before the Supreme Court now. One of the issues is that this case, there's no end to the tariffs. Normally when the president has issued emergency powers under AIPA, it's been a very short amount of time. It's been 150 days. It's been 90 days. But these seem to just be going on in perpetuity, and there's no demonstration that the tariffs are actually having the intended effect of reducing the threat that they were intended to. And so there is some question here, much like what, Jim and I were kind of exploring in our more recent blog when the president, threatened to issue all of these tariffs against countries supporting Denmark, and when the United States was interested in taking over Greenland. Just are these tariffs arbitrary? And how does that relate back to the chemical regulatory industry? Well, if these tariffs or these taxes can be imposed rather arbitrarily on any country or any industry just at someone's whim, then that creates a very challenging environment in which to conduct business.
Would seem to me to operate as a unique deterrent.
Right. Well, and again, I think that's part of the various coverage of the state of the economy, right? I mean, investment decisions, foreign and domestic, are a little bit interrupted by the uncertainty. And certainly longer term planning for, do you want to build your factory here? You want to build your factory there? Kinds of questions. The other thing that I find interesting about it, not to play, nerdy historian, but people don't realize typically that taxing what we call taxes, which everyone, and it's soon to be on us again, right? Tax season is upon us now, et cetera. But mostly the government, until literally 100 years ago or so, the early 20th century, tariffs and things on, alcohol and other kinds of goods is basically what funded the entire government. There were no income taxes, right?
Hmm.
So, Congress assert itself here, even separate from what the Supreme Court may do in terms of saying, well, it is or isn't authorized, and maybe the people, I know you guys are the lawyers, but gee, if you're one of the parties that's actually filed, you might get your money back. If you haven't filed, well, you're not really a party here, so maybe the government doesn't need to give it back. I mean, I find all those legal beagle things pretty interesting.
Yeah, yeah, there are endless number of questions,
Yeah,
and legal
but
scholars are speculating on all
sure.
of those issues relentlessly.
But fundamentally, it's like, okay, Congress gets to do the taxing power, sort of a
Mhm.
more fundamental concept, and that was pretty bedrock for the first, well, I guess 150 of the 250 years since it's our anniversary as a country, et cetera. So, I mean, that's going to be a real fundamental question that's underneath whatever they decide at the Supreme Court, because it's going to be back to what Congress can and can't do, separate from all the other debates about, given the current president's desire to emphasize, you know, unitary theory, executive orders, etc. But especially in this space, it's the early test of some of those, shall we say, an early indication that it's beyond an early test of the theory, but again, an early indication of where the Supreme Court's going to come down on those kind of issues.
Right, exactly. What do you think, Jim? Do you think it's gonna be issued sooner rather than later? And does the timing of the decision reflect its probable directional trend?
Um, yeah, I think it can be sooner than later. Mostly, I say that just from what we all read in the funny papers or whatever, the local, the fancy words for a local bookie in my father's world. But the real issue is more over time. What's it mean for again, what I just mentioned a little bit about the broad authority of Congress v. executive. But the other thing over time too is going to be an interesting question is related to something my experience, not with Supreme Court things. I never had to deal with that, thankfully, in so many ways, but simply expert panels in our space as regulatory matters for chemical and pesticides, typically for our client base. The question is often, well, maybe there ought to be some kind of grand poobah panel who could decide whether chemical X is good or bad, or the risk policy ought to be X or Y, or things like that. And typically, those panels, in my experience, tend to want to shy away from the political element of those decisions. And so, most recently for the pesticide space, for example, ESA, well, we're going to have the National Academy of Sciences tell exactly how EPA should do an Endangered Species Act assessment. And their answer is, well, here's how you could do it. Here's some considerations. Here's some comment on how EPA at the time, this is now 20 years ago, was doing it at that time. But fundamentally, the political issue of do it very extensively, do it very minimally, no, that's the political decision. So we're not really taking a hard answer on that. So the expert panels sometimes want to be expert in spaces where they can be expert, not try and get into the political stuff, if you will. And I
Mhm.
think the Supremes will be similarly thinking that way here, because we know that this tariff issue is going to be read as an indicator. It's going to be, ooh, the tea leaves now mean that they're telling Mr. Trump he doesn't have all this authority. But again, here it's the authority over trade issues and whether or not, as Claire just described, interdiction of illegal drugs is enough of a trigger for this utilization of the emergency power. And so they're going to, and that's a long way of me saying that my prediction is they'll keep it narrow at this point, and
Yeah,
at
yeah,
some
of
point,
course.
and at some point they'll have to keep getting into some of those other issues, because there's thousands, right, or at least hundreds probably of lawsuits piled up on these underneath issues of how much authority does this administration have to do what they say they can and have done so far, whether by executive order, firing a bunch of federal employees, wiping away appropriated funds. All those issues are stacking up that are under the big bucket of where are the limits of power, and what are the separation of power? What are the lines on the separation of powers of the three branches of government?
I would imagine foreign entities or foreign companies wishing to do business here and considering entering the U.S. market are similarly watching the court just as much as domestic companies are.
I can't imagine they're not, and maybe again shying away from. Maybe we'll wait for all this dust to settle a little
Well,
more
exactly.
before we decide to invest or not.
Because even if the Supreme Court hedges its bets and has, as you suggest, Jim, a very narrow interpretation of, it's the president's authority unilaterally to impose tariffs under certain conditions, there might be some deference given to, timing considerations. To your point, Claire, tariffs shouldn't be applied and then in perpetuity left unattended, because that might have a disquieting effect on markets and foreign investment in the United States. Given the fragility of markets on a good day, the imposition of tariffs at will for indeterminate periods of time and sometimes at very high rates could pose over the long term a distinctly disquieting effect on the U.S. economy and foreign markets generally.
Yeah, and there's an indication that increasingly states that have historically been red states could be becoming frustrated with the current state of things because a lot of states that are typically considered red states are involved in a lot of business and a lot of
Yeah,
trade
diverse business
with
operations.
other countries. And so as recently as last week, the House of Representatives voted 219 to 211 to revoke the tariffs that President Donald Trump imposed.
Mhm.
And but
On,
just
on
specifically in
Canada,
Canada.
right?
Just in
Claire, I think that
Canada.
was on
Just in
Canada.
Canada.
We're still
Not in
after
general.
Greenland. We're
I'm
still
not
after Greenland.
not starting rumors. But so just the fact that Republicans in general are willing to just say that they are not aligned with President Trump on this particular
On this
issue
issue, sure.
because it may be hurting their constituents is a pretty big deal, especially under this administration.
Yeah. No, it was a very significant vote. Noted. Well, your blog spent a good deal of time trying to identify some signals that companies should be looking at. So looking ahead, what are those signals? What advice can you be giving listeners now that are interested in these topics on what are the issues that will be helping us understand better where directionally U.S. policy is headed and how might they manage their operations in a way that is mindful of these implications? Jim?
Well, for starters, again, partly, and Claire just mentioned it, the role of Congress is not just a role in terms of having hearings or oversights or appropriations, which are all non-trivial things, but even, again, saying that, hey, what you're doing with Canada, and that vote was she just mentioned, what you're doing with Canada is something we don't like. We don't think you have authority for that, or to the extent you do have authority, we're going to reverse it. And it's not only sort of a precedent because with how much this Congress has been able to buck what the administration wants or suggests that they do, but also appropriations. So if we've appropriated money for this program, for this bridge, for this set of institutions, for example, if you could roll back the clock 2 years or more, but USAID, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Congress thought they were appropriating money for a certain purpose. And it turns out that, at least this administration says that, well, we can change the government's mind because we kind of are the government. And so those are all big ticket issues about what's going to continue to be an evolving issue and what companies have to worry about because, again, what if you go into an agreement, and I know in, state government, certainly some of these state government funds to help businesses develop industries in their state come from the federal government. Well, what
Right.
if you're not in a favored state, if you will, or favored status to be more different words, but a favored status as a state with this administration? The money that was given to you to help business development in your state, you then had a development grant of some kind with a private sector entity, and then it gets pulled out from under them, or just becomes uncertain. It gets litigated. The check is not in the mail. What do you do if you're trying to plan your new factory? That the new factory is going to cost $600 million. A third of that was coming in effect for some kind of subsidy from governmental entities. And that program goes away in the middle of your whole planning or worse, construction process. And those are the kinds of things that, again, reliability, uncertainty, unpredictability become a real problem for planning as a company, as a business, as anything, just because you don't know what tomorrow holds.
Well, do you expect congressional engagement on trade authority to be an issue? I mean, in this mid-year election year, oversight hearings, legislation. I don't expect legislation, period, between now and the midterms.
Well, sure. I mean, there's no uh, rule of thumb when I was, before I worked for the administration, I worked for, various congressional offices. I worked for a congressman, I worked for a senator over my time. Um, and so basically, for a midterm, if you don't have real progress made on your legislative ideas by the Easter recess, it's
Mhm.
not going to happen. And that was a long time ago when Congress was relatively civilized. Didn't look like it at the time always, but compared to the current dynamic. And so if you really don't have a serious amount of momentum behind your proposal, a serious bipartisan backing, and a sort of must-do vehicle, you're probably not going to see it enacted in this year until the midterms. And I think the list of what would make that, you know, check the box on all those criterion would be a pretty short list. So again, that's back to our audience. Are there going to be any kind of significant fill in the blank amendments on pesticides, on chemicals, on trade? Trade might make that list in some ways because it's been so much. It's not just that it's in the news, but it's been so important even as a revenue raiser. Because again, back to the Supreme Court opinion, if they basically say some of these tariffs are not really authorized, number one, well, then, of course, he has other authority to still reimpose all those tariffs, we're told, or I'm told, what I read. But at the same time, where's the money going to come from? Because it really is generating a lot of revenue. And the deficit issue is once again creeping up in the public consciousness of deficits. Deficits matter because the national debt is getting so large. All those, again, it's the political version of the knee bones connected to the shin bone, I guess. But again, they are connected and they're going to have an impact over time.
And Claire, it goes without saying that companies should be watching the Supreme Court for indications of when the decision in VOS selections will issue. And then, of course, understand what the implications are, whether the Supreme Court agrees with Mr. Trump or disagrees, but has a very narrow interpretation, understanding quickly what that decision means when it is issued, which presumably will be sometime this year before they adjourn in the summer. You know, what say you?
Companies should definitely be watching this Supreme Court case. I think they should also be watching how Congress is speaking about this case and how they're responding to this case. Trump regularly posts on his Truth Social page about, the so-called tariff case, and this is the case that he is referring to. So even he's saying in his 2 a.m. tweets to watch this case, and
I think he's positioning that statement a little differently.
I think he is. I think he
In a
is,
little more
but
partisan
it
context.
does reemphasize just the importance that this case has in this space. And so anyone, whether you're in the United States doing business or whether you're outside of the United States, doing trade either directly or peripherally with the United States through some downstream traders, this is something that you're definitely going to want to pay attention to because it will have an effect on your bottom line.
Agree.
And one thing I would also add that something Claire's brought up more than what I tend to think about. I'm a more domestic focused kind of, mindset, but the European government, for just by one example, back to some of the initiatives that we've already talked about, or the other global governments, they're not going away anytime soon, notwithstanding Greenland. But if you have to comply with those requirements in Europe about fill in the blank, whether it be carbon loadings, sustainability, words that maybe are forbidden words now over here are still in force over there. And so if you're a company that has that global presence, you're very much aware of that, number one. But even if you're a company that's trying to go global, we talked about that, or even if you're not really thinking about it much, but because your customer may be partly affected by all these things, then you've got to worry about it too. And so you've got to worry about, notwithstanding that we want to say we do or don't care more or less about XYZ things, those foreign governments, they do all this stuff. They worry about sustainable this or that, or whether it be plastic pollution or the forestry initiative or the even human rights kind of issues and things like that, that it affects those not just the customers very directly that may our clients that have customers over there in those foreign markets, but again, customers they have here, but their customers hope to have some of the foreign presence either currently or soon. And so it really has, again, an interaction effect of you need to not just, it's a cliche to say you need to pay attention to this space, but unforeseen circumstances could then obtain. And Claire, I don't know if you want to add a little more to that because you've handled a lot more of those, the focus on those international initiatives and requirements.
Yeah, I mean, I think this issue around tariffs and around, I'm not going to say a trade war, but just where companies or countries are competing and kind of trading back and forth advantages and disadvantages financially, then there are also regulatory ways that companies are empowering or that countries are empowering other countries to engage in like deforestation or to reduce pollution or to have a more circular economy. And so there are ways that you can use trade to incentivize or disincentivize certain behaviors. And I think the European Union has definitely made their position on that topic clear with all of the initiatives that they're in the process of implementing to reduce deforestation, to increase circularity, to have products that are more recyclable or more environmentally friendly. And if the United States wants to continue doing business with those countries, then that's something that the companies within the United States are going to have to address.
Is it getting tougher? Because if our country's official policy is saying things like worrying about sustainability or other kinds of things, I'm not trying to make light of it, but I mean, we're de emphasizing those. Does it make some of those initiatives more likely to get tougher over there, or that they could just, you know, in addition to deriding our twists and turns of policies potentially, but is there a potential impact on the requirements themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're getting, I don't want to get too far off topic, but if you look at the trajectory of the way that European regulations have moved in the last even just 10 years, Europe has been increasing all of its regulations, whether it's around microplastics, whether it's around
PFAS,
deforestation, whether it's around PFAS in particular. And
deforestation.
it's not just Europe. Canada has similar initiatives. And so if you look at the trajectory of the United States federal government and the way that it's kind of flip-flopped based on various administrations, and, kind of predictably under the Obama administration and the first Trump administration and then the Biden administration and then now the second Trump administration. Things have been a little chaotic, but if you look towards the global foreign market, that has actually had a relatively stabilizing effect on just the disequilibrium of things in the United States. Because Europe has just kind of said, okay, well, we're going to embrace sustainability. We're going to embrace ESG and circularity. And so whether or not the United States changes its mind on various topics, the EU has remained relatively stable and consistent in its goals.
That is certainly my view as well, Clara, that the consistency with respect to those principles has been a guiding force in virtually all other jurisdictions. There might be some slowing a little bit in the European Union.
Hmm.
Some of the more conservative factions have kind of slowed, certainly the PFAS regulatory initiative, but slowing and changing course are very different propositions. And for companies, getting back to our topic, domestic policy, trade policy, international developments has such a profound effect on doing business here in the United States. Our listeners are encouraged to track, monitor, and engage whenever and however possible to ensure that they are fully aware of the implications of these decisions on their business operations. And it's tough because it's very difficult to predict and very difficult to be nimble in a volatile environment such as we have now. Claire, Jim, I want to thank you for a very engaging conversation, and stay tuned, sports fans. The Supreme Court should be issuing a decision sooner or later, and we will know much more then than we do now as to the implication of trade policy and the president's authority to impose tariffs unilaterally and based on decisions that historically have not been recognized in trade policy in the United States. So, Jim, Claire, thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My thanks again to Claire and Jim for speaking with me today about global issues and their influence on domestic chemical regulation. All Things Chemical is produced by Jackson Bierfeld of Bierfeld Audio, LLC. We will be back again soon to further inform and entertain you about all things chemical. Bye-bye.